Hello and welcome to Decoded.
A WRI-India series that breaks down complex climate concepts with the help of experts. I am Aditi Sundan, Communications Manager at WRI-India, and today I have with me Dr. Nambi Appadurai, Executive Director of the Climate Resilience Practice Program at World Resources Institute, India, to decode locally led adaptation. Dr. Nambi, thank you for joining us for this conversation. So let's start by talking about what is locally led adaptation and how is it different from other adaptation approaches.
Thank you, Aditi. Locally led adaptation is an evolving concept, and it is more of a bottom-up, inclusive, responsive, and flexible process, taking into consideration the needs and resources of the climate vulnerable people, including knowledge, skills, practices of local communities and stakeholders in adaptation planning. Adaptation is a very local phenomenon. India is such a huge country. It has very different agroecological zones. We can't have a one blanket plan to sort of implement adaptation plans and actions. So it's very important to understand the needs of the local people, to factor that and come out with a good planning process so that it is more effective at the ground level. So the entire idea of local adaptation is to establish a locally driven process where the community's needs are reflected very effectively, so that they have a ownership that has been created, which will be long lasting rather than being a top down sort of an approach where it doesn't last long. That's the essence of LLA.
Right. And you hinted at how for India this is particularly important because it is so locally, it just focuses so much on the local context. So, in light of the climate risks that India faces and its diverse geography, can you talk a little more about why it is important or relevant for India?
Say, for example, the people who live in proximities with where the impacts are felt have a better knowledge generally, because they know what kind of impact they face and what are the sort of locally driven solutions also they have. We can't completely alienate these people, come out with a different kind of a outside solution, externally driven solution, and expect it to fit the local circumstances. Most of the times that's been trusted and that's a top-down approach. Whereas in the local bottom-up approach, the people become the central part of the whole planning process. So their needs are well reflected. The repository of knowledge which is there with them, those are the entry points for designing anything which is very valuable and long lasting in a local context. And not only the problems, they also have some time tested solutions over a period of time. But only thing is the climate change is happening at a very rapid pace where they cannot really cope up with the traditional mechanisms what they have. So this external aid in terms of the climate risk information that goes into that, then it makes the job easier. And that's marrying science with the local knowledge. Then it has certain values in the local context. So that's the bottom line of the locally led adaptation process. And India has very diverse, as you all know, it's a very diverse country with 127 agroecological zones. The problems are plenty. It's very difficult to come out with a very uniform, one-size-fit-all solution. So it's important to design this at a local level so that people own that. And also they are so comfortable using those solutions and also provide some of the knowledge and skill sets to carry this LLA agenda forward. And it is also not only the inclusiveness and decision-making integration that matters. It is also the leadership that counts, panchayat leaders at the bottom level. Their commitment is very important in driving this process. So the community becomes the focus of this whole thing and they drive the whole process in a sense. That's what it means.
And as you mentioned how local leadership is a very important principle for LLA. What is the role of principles of climate justice and equity? And how can these be integrated? And what are the challenges to integrating them actually on the field in your experience?
Yeah. At local level, there are lots of politics. And anyway, it's universal, not only in India. Definitely, there are certain power structures which operate at the local level. Normally, it's very difficult to break those structures. Because there are sometimes it's the political affiliations they have. Sometimes this is a charismatic leader who's there and the loyalty to those leaders counts. So this constantly drives a divide among the communities. The locally led adaptation is more conscious about breaking this power structure so that there is a empowerment of the local communities. In other words, it's decentralization of be it, the planning process or the fiscal mobilization. So all these things needs a push. So unless that is being done, in certain sections of society are left out. India, that caste and creed are one of the important, and also people with the power normally are who has the resources. So, the adaptation as well. Generally, when you talk about adaptation, people who have all these capacities, technology at their disposal, the access to technologies, people who have access to technologies, they are better off because of the power structure. So normally, even in a small example, generally, when you get some extension officers go to the field, agriculture extension officers, there are certain preferred people, whom because of the power and influence, they have the first level of access to these resources, whatever, be it a subsidy or whatever you talk about. So whereas the people are always left out, the people at the lower rung of the ladder, always the downtrodden are left out. So how do we sort of make their voices heard? How do they sort of be participated in this process? How they've been given a space matters so much in terms of establishing the social justice. So it is nothing new, but then very conscious effort is put on within the climate risk framework to understand their own risks. Again, among the vulnerable people, marginalized people, there are different sections even within that. So that we have to address this intervariability within those sections. Like, for example, women, children, elderly, and the handicapped or disabled people. They are the most sort of affected people. They don't have the access to many of the resources which are meant for those, which is generated through the local government structures. So this makes a very conscious effort to create that space for them so that the social justice is established.
Right. And because you mentioned decision making at the local level as well, and making sure that the leadership lies at the local level for this as well. Part of enabling decision making is adaptation finance. So that there is a need for targeted adaptation finance has been discussed. But what does the landscape of adaptation finance look like in India today?
See, one of the basic critiques across the world is, a lot of money goes to mitigation. Mitigation adaptations are two response options for climate impacts to manage climate risks. So always the world is so focused and obsessed with the mainstreaming efforts, be it renewable energy. We talk about solar and sort of all these mitigation efforts in terms of gear to sort of reduce the emissions. It gets the preferences. The whole world is obsessed with that, and hence the money flow is also there. Whereas adaptation is always seen as sort of embedded in the development processes. So which is mostly to do with the public finance. And that is why, it is always seen, again, for a country like India, and other countries as well in the same status, sort of universally speaking, the adaptation money has to be generated internally within the country, whereas there are other sources for the mitigation related efforts, investments from other in the CD, the sort of carbon credit mechanisms. There are umpteen number of options. Whereas for resilience building and adaptation measures, it's all part of the development funding. So already we have sort of those development aid and stuff today. Not only the aid, even the money what we have to spend, like for a country like India, large scale country like India, it's not going to be easy. So the adaptation, there is always an adaptation finance deficit. So how do you sort of address this? So there are several mechanisms where, we sort of generate their own resources. So the first point is sort of understand the given resources in a local context. What are they? We have to map those things to understand those. And then it's mostly, as I mentioned earlier, it is public money which flows in. Public finances dominate still the adaptation space. But it is not very attractive to the private players, because there's not much of profit. Of course, there are a lot of other things coming up today, but then, generally speaking, it's seen as a public good. So that is the reason the money is not there much. So now of late, there are very interesting and innovative mechanisms coming out. Even talking about the public finance, every MP has been allocated a local fund, MP LAD, they call us, local area development fund, which typically goes to development activities like building schools and, healthcare. So how do we sort of, use this money for climate related activities is one of those questions. You should examine that. Similarly, the members of legislative assemblies also have some money for their own constituencies. So how do we tap those things? These are some of the ways we could really, sort of be a little more innovative. Again, MNREGA, the Employment Guarantee Scheme, is another best way, because the components of MNREGA to generate employment is typically forest, rural role building. This has a component of adaptation. Whatever we do has some significance to the adaptation context. So how do you sort of intelligently use this, smartly use these things, becomes one of the important area of focus. And also CSR money of late. A lot of corporate social responsibility money is also flowing in now. So that is also important to tap them for climate risk related activities, in other words, resilience activities. So there are innovative mechanisms across the world as well. There is another UN CDF fund, United Nations Capital Development Fund, which has a locale program, which is a locally led climate adaptive living. That particular program is very focused on decentralized, supporting the local governments in terms of doing a performance-based assessment. For example, the World Bank provides money for a rural road construction work. It is a typical development effort. They might not be sort of investing on the climate component of it. How do you sort of climate proof these roads? That is the additional money what you need to sort of tap. UNCDF provides that sort of a money after an assessment of how much it costs. It's a topic of money over the existing sort of loans or whatever the local government gets. So there are different mechanisms today, blended finance. All these things are coming up, innovative finance. And also it is important to look at the microfinance stuff, which are existing so that people have the access, even for the livelihoods, not only the infrastructure part of it. How do you sort of, use this to mitigate the risks of climate change at the local level, particularly agriculture, farmers, not even day after tomorrow counts for them. So it's important for them to sort of, constantly get this access to technology, capacities, skill sets, and the money.
I'll ask one follow-up question here, Dr. Nambi, which is that while adaptation finance is difficult to access, is it particularly harder to access it for locally led adaptation programs as opposed to top-down adaptation approaches? If so, is there a reason?
Yeah, I would say, one of the important reasons for people not being able to access this money is because of their sort of awareness level. They don't even know what kind of schemes and programs that exist. It might be a typical development program, but it has a climate relevance to it. So that is why the climate tagging of budget also is important. What kind of money, which is typically spent as development money, what sort of a climate component is involved in it? These contingency plans, there are several sort of, public finances available. So the awareness is not there to sort of, even if it is there, they're not in a position to access it. That is why it is important to facilitate, to create that kind of an awareness. What is in there and how do they use these resources, whatever is available at the local level, to channelize the money for climate risk management at the local level. So that has become one of the critical sort of challenges people don't understand, and also sort of connecting those risks to the availability of money. That's why one should understand the different schemes, programs, policies at the local level, so that it becomes a vehicle to carry those things. Not that new money has to come. Of course, it is important because whatever we have is not adequate. But still, how do you sort of leverage that money which is already available to sort of manage climate risks at the local level? That becomes one of the priority areas for any local government. That capacity should be there. That's very important to sort of inculcate those skill sets, the capacities, and the knowledge base for them to sort of use these resources.
And considering that all of these things must align in order for locally led adaptation to work effectively, I was wondering if you could share an example of what does locally led adaptation look like on the ground, and if there's an example of locally led adaptation in action in India or a model elsewhere. Could you please talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think of late there are across India several cities and states that are working on this to build the resilient measures. It's become one of the agenda at the state level, mostly a subnational level. A lot of work is going on. I would quote from an example from Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu government is very proactive. They've set up a Tamil Nadu Green Climate Company to channelize this money to so that it's going to the right sort of place where there is a need. For example, most vulnerable geographies and vulnerable communities, they try to direct this money through this channel that is available. Also, they have different missions targeted to sort of address these issues, the vulnerability issues at different levels. So I think one of the good examples where we are working is on the climate smart villages, in other words, climate resilient villages. These are villages which are the chosen villages which are most impacted and also in vulnerable geographic zones. So we need to sort of come out with a very specialized program for this. We start at the district level and we have devised a tool like DCAP, that is a district climate adaptation prioritization tool that is called DCPAPT. So this is sort of, working with the local governments, with the line department officials, and also the communities. We identify those priorities. There are already certain existing schemes and stuff. Given the sort of, climate trends, what you see for those districts, then we try to understand the scenarios, in 10 years time, what is going to be the impact? What is the impact level? how vulnerable, and there are some in coastal areas, coastal erosion, salinity. These are very critical issues. So how do you sort of prioritize those issues? So we sort of match those resources with the knowledge what they have. Plus, additionally, we bring the scientific aspect to those things so that the people have the better understanding of the risks. First of all, the first starting point is to understand the risks. Unless you understand the risks, you cannot design a solution. Yeah. There are certain level of understanding should be there, and DCAP and climate smart agriculture and climate smart resilient villages are typical models where you design programs and try to implement at the local level to address the issues. And also in the process, you also sort of empower the people with technical skills, the financial access you create. So that is a very comprehensive solution you get.